This episode I'm joined by Daniel Liechty, who is a longtime reader and interpreter of Ernest Becker's writings. He's especially interested in the implications of Becker's work in religion and spirituality, and its applications in psychotherapy. His Becker-related books include Theology in Postliberal Perspective, Transference and Transcendence, Thinking About Faith in a Post-Christian Time, and the Ernest Becker Reader. We discuss the work and life of Ernest Becker, touching on his best-selling book, The Denial of Death, alongside discussions on meaning, religion, and faith. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you would like to support Hermitix podcast or become part of the community, please find links in the description below. And as this episode is going out on New Year's Day 2021, I would like to wish all of my listeners and viewers and subscribers and patrons a Happy New Year. And I'd like to thank everyone who has supported me thus far. I expect Hermitix to be even bigger in 2021. So thank you all and have a great new year. Enjoy. Okay, so Daniel Liechty, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Nice to be here.
Just before, we are going to be talking about the work of Ernest Becker, author of The Denial of Death, alongside other books, whose names have just completely vanished from my mind, but everyone will sort of know Ernest Becker because of The Denial of Death. But ironically, which we'll probably get to, it's been forgotten. I would say so. But before we jump in with Becker, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and your work.
Well, my work, my position is that I'm a professor of social work at Illinois State University. That's a large state university in the Midwest in the United States. And my background, actually, I had trained to be a religious studies professor, and then kind of switched over. The job market wasn't good, and a lot of other things like that. And so I found myself working in a mental hospital as I guess you could say, my title there was an educator in an inpatient mental hospital. This is back in the late 80s, early 90s. And this particular hospital was very academic. I mean, it was a teaching hospital and was the seat of the Philadelphia Psychoanalytic Society and that kind of thing. I mean, this was a pretty high quality inpatient mental hospital, very Freudian. And a lot of the younger Freudians, a lot of the younger psychiatrists, I should say, kind of knew that when it came to religion and so forth, that Freud didn't really give them a full-rounded picture. They knew that there was some problems with it. But on the other hand, they had their work to do and patients to see and so forth. And so, they just, it was kind of hanging out there, I guess you could say. But when they found out that they had someone on staff who knew something about religion, it really got to the point, little by little, that psychiatrists were coming to me and asking me to try to help them understand their patients' religious ideations. I mean, what they'd been trained in was the idea that religious ideations are just symptomatic of the illness, and when the illness is cleared up, the ideations will go away. But as I say, especially the younger ones, kind of knew that there was maybe more to it than that, and so I started doing a lot of consultation at this hospital, not just in the program I was in. I was in the young adult program, 18 to 30-year-olds, but not just in the young adult program, but across the hospital, doing consultation with psychiatrists whose patients had strong religious ideations, and just trying to help them, first of all, understand the ideations, but second of all, if possible, see if there's some way to actually use those ideations in the fight against the illness. And so I started doing more and more of this, and I got very interested in the whole cross section, I guess you could say, of religion and and psychiatry or religion and psychology. Nowadays, if you go into a bookstore or whatever, you just have tons of books on, whole sections of books on religion and psychology, but that really wasn't the case back then. And so I was doing this work, and I actually then trained became a group therapist at that institute. Went through their training program and started practicing as a group therapist as well. And I really started feeling like, wow, this is not just, a job to pay the bills till next year's hiring comes around at the American Academy of Religion, annual meeting. As many of the jobs I'd had previously were to me. I was teaching middle school history, that kind of thing. And those were just getting the bills paid till I could find a job in the teaching religion. I started feeling, now this is a position that really, it's a professional position. This is using what I've learned in a professional capacity. And it was very exciting. It was very, it was kind of pioneering in a way. And at least certainly at that facility, it was pioneering. And I could have really, I started really thinking, well, this is long-term. I'm going to be here for 25, 30 years. Well, then what happened was that managed care hit, and long-term inpatient mental treatment was just not what managed care was going to pay for. Everything was moving towards outpatient, and I remember, at grand rounds when the first time someone raised their hand, they had the chief medical officer there doing the grand rounds, and someone said, well, we've been hearing this thing about managed care. And he sort of harumphed. This is what's funny. He harumphed. Huh. We're the institute. We tell the insurance companies what patients need, not the other way around. So you could see that we were just absolutely unprepared for managed care. And once this thing started hitting, literally within a year, there were just no patients there anymore. And floor after floor just started shutting down. And in the end, they shut the whole institute down and sold the property. I mean, it was it was 40 acres of woods and paths and beautiful buildings and so forth, right in the middle of West Philadelphia. I mean, it was really a nice place. But anyway, the point is, here I find myself now, the place is closed. The place I was thinking I might be at for 25 or 30 years is closed. And as long as I was at this place, at the Institute, that was the source of my credibility in this field. But when I found myself cut loose from that, well, then I thought I should go back and retrain and get some kind of something in the field that will lead towards licensing and so forth. So that's how I got into social work. I went back to social work school, and then when I got out of social work school, instead of just my original intent was I would probably just hang up a shingle and do private practice, but during my time in social work school, I became interested in hospice work, which was also at that time brand new. It had been already quite established in England, but it was just coming into America. And so when I graduated from social work school, I actually went into hospice work instead of psychotherapy or psychology directly. Of course, in hospice, you deal with emotions and, all these kind of things, but it's not mental health treatment per se. It's dealing with grief. It's dealing with questions about meaning in life and all those kind of things that come up, family issues and so forth, but it's not directly, psychotherapy. And so I did hospice work and like I say, this was the very early days. I mean, in a way, I was helping to define what a hospice social worker was every day when I went to work. There were no models for me previously. And so I was part of that group of people that really helped to define what it is that a hospice social worker does. And so I did that for a number of years, and I started, to make a long story short, I got tapped to come out to Illinois here to help get a MS Masters of Social Work program up and running. And I originally thought that I'd be here maybe about 5 years, but now this is my 22nd year here. It seemed like every time there was an offer to move, it wasn't a good time for my family to make a move. And so here I am 22 years later, and probably I'm sure I'll be here till I retire now.
Okay.
So that's kind of my professional background. I had gotten involved with Becker way back in seminary. That would have been in the fall of 76. No, yes, fall of 76 that I first ran across Becker's writings. It was a chapter of his was assigned as a reading in one of the courses I took, and I just was really, blown away by this guy, and within a very short time, I was amassing anything of his that I could find to read, and really was quite enthused about his point of view, and especially the take on religion and so forth. But I couldn't find at that time anybody else who, in fact, when I would search the secondary literature. Now, this, of course, was back before the internet and all that. I mean, this was back when searching secondary literature meant going through card catalogs and these big books called books in print or literature in print, those kind of things. But the only thing I could really find of people who were reading Becker, ironically, were people like, so this would have been late 70s. The only thing I could find were in professional journals of the life insurance industry, where salesmen were talking to each other and saying, you can sell people life insurance, but if you really want to sell them life insurance, make them feel like a hero to their, and they're using Becker's stuff how to spur in people the willingness to spend even more on life insurance than they would otherwise. And so I was, I was a little bit, I don't know, not put off, but at least I was wondering, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe second guessing myself as to how important this guy was. If I'm the only one who thinks this, is that really, but I stuck with it. And finally, while I was at the Institute, I also started a program in pastoral counseling, a doctoral degree in pastoral counseling. It was a extension program, so actually the Institute shut down there before I got that degree. But what I did was I decided, well, look, I'm gonna write my dissertation will be about Becker and his writings, and then that'll get it out of my system, and then I'll go on to study stuff that'll actually get me somewhere professionally. And so I wrote that dissertation, and it got published as a book. And I was ready to just put that aside now. Okay, Becker's out of my system. But because of that book, that's how the people at the Ernest Becker Foundation, which was just starting up at that time, found out about me. And here comes a phone call from Neil Elgee, the founder of that. And it turned out there was this whole group of people from all kinds of different disciplines that were just like me. They were reading Becker. They knew he was important. They were, they slip him in here and there and so forth, but also thinking that they were probably the only ones that were interested in this guy. And so through the foundation, then we all got to know each other. And we've had, there was 20 years there where we'd have annual conferences and other kinds of cooperative ventures and so forth. And so, so that kind of is the story of why Becker has stayed central to my academic life and to my, I would say even more than academic life. I mean, I feel like in a way, Becker's ideas sort of form my philosophy, the philosophy of life that I live by, I suppose, in a way. Oftentimes someone says, now, is that something you think, or is that something Becker thinks? And I have to scratch my head and try to remember, is that something that I read in him, or is that an interpretation of him, that I've read and but anyway, yeah, in a way, his work has sort of contoured my personal way of living, I suppose you could say, way of thinking about life, at least.
Yeah, I was going to say many of the sort of biographical moments and events of your life that you mentioned there seem to correspond with an aspect of Becker's work.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, isn't
it? The early Freudianism, his views of religion, and then the pastoral care and hospice care with this idea of meaning and purpose in relation to death. So I think much of that will come back in when we begin to speak with Becker, and I hope it does. But I do have to ask you the Hermitix question. You can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick? And we can include Becker in there, as we're already talking about him.
I'm listening in on the conversation, or I'm in the conversation?
Your choice.
That would make a difference.
Your choice.
Because see, if I'm in the conversation, then I can have some input as to what topics we're talking about. But I suppose if so I've thought about this in terms of 3 people I'd like to have in the room with me, having a conversation with me and with each other. Probably Jesus, and Muhammad, and well, I guess I have to say Becker, but actually there's a German theologian, Jürgen Moltmann, that I would like to have in that room as well.
Okay. Do you mind if I ask, are you religious?
Religious people think I'm atheist, and atheist people think I'm religious.
Okay.
If that makes any sense.
So
I'm a questioner. My inclination is always to not I don't want to say that I'm just contrary, but my inclination is to question the certainties that are being placed in front. If I'm in conversation with convinced atheists, I'm bringing up the other side, and if I'm in conversation with convinced religious people, I'm bringing up the other side. But I am, I was raised in the Mennonite church, and I still basically hold Mennonite values, especially community and pacifism and other things like that. And I am a Gentile member of a Jewish temple, a Reformed temple, and have been for 20 years or more. And I'm also a member of the Ruhaniyat order of American Sufism. And so, yeah, I guess you could say that active religious participation is a big part of my life. Yeah.
Okay. So the only one I don't know there is was it Moltzmann?
Jürgen Moltmann.
Jürgen Moltmann. Okay. So what was his sort of perspective?
Well, he was, like I say, he was a German theologian who I learned to. I started reading his stuff late in college and then into seminary, and he wrote. There were a couple really important books that came out right at that time. One of them was called The Theology of Hope, and then the one that I was most taken with was one called The Crucified God. And he was a Christian theologian, and that whole concept of having the Lord of the universe in a way pictured as the one who is the most vulnerable and the most not the unmoved mover that everyone bows down to, but rather the one who's the servant and who gives his life for others as being held up as the highest good. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. That's what I really liked about Moltmann. Now, Moltmann was very influenced by Marxism and other things, which a lot of Americans, I think those kind of influences probably they didn't hurt him at all in Europe, but I think they limited his readership here in America because of, he was just really clear about, his attachment to socialist Marxist ideas and so forth.
Okay. So where do you think that where would you like that conversation between those four people and yourself, so five people? Where would you like that to sort of head? Do you think it would head somewhere organically?
I think what I would like to, I guess the topic I would like to bring up, and then just be able to have each of them interact with each other about it, is the whole question of what makes human life on this planet, meaningful. What is it that, what, and I'm not saying that has to be one thing. I mean, that's part of the reason I think each one would have their little, their special take on it. But what is it that is at the heart of meaning for human existence? And I think Jesus and Muhammad would probably point very much in direction of, a real spiritual connection with God. And Becker and Moltmann and myself probably would see God probably more as a symbol than as a ontological reality. And that would be kind of where the discussion would go. Okay.
I think that's a good room. I'm not sure. Do you think there'd be any sort of clashes of temperament in there?
Well, I don't know any of them in terms of their personalities. I don't know any of them personally, so I don't know. I mean, one thing I've learned in my life is that a lot of times these people that through books, and you just think they're wonderful people, you meet them and they're really not very nice. Yeah. You know what I mean? They're real cantankerous a lot of times, or they're really, but so who knows what kind of, but I think that my sense of each one of these people is that they would recognize in the other something that they could, that something important that they could learn from. And so you don't learn from other people by being cantankerous to them, Mm-hmm. And so my sense is that it would be a very fruitful discussion. Not that all four would necessarily come to the same conclusion, but that each would maybe themes that are dominant for one would be subdominant for another, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. But that we would come up with I think after a couple hours of good discussion, and maybe Jesus would change some water into wine for us and all that kind of stuff, we would come up with some, with maybe what would you say? Maybe a good chi-square of ideas that interact with each other in different ways, depending on what you emphasize and what's dominant and what's subdominant.
Okay. Maybe some of them thinkers will come in, but come back later. I'm sure they will. But to move into Becker specifically, this is probably my favorite irony in the history of philosophy. It's quite niche, I guess, if people haven't read Becker. But here we have The Denial of Death, undoubtedly Becker's most famous work, which very roughly, I'm sure we'll get into the intricacies, but very roughly is Becker's idea put forth is that civilization as a symbol is constructed as a way for us to ignore our mortality, the fact that we will die.
To keep it from immediate consciousness, yes.
Yeah. Now, this book, which is a winner of a Pulitzer Prize, is very ironically has been pretty much ignored since publication, I would say. If you agree, why do you think this is?
Well, again, I think it depends what you mean by ignored. It's never gone out of print since 1973. So, I mean, that's pretty, there's not very many books that you can say that to. Also, I should have looked this up, but I can't think of the title right now. But back in the late 90s, or maybe it was the early 2000s, somebody did, a journalist type guy ask all these different famous people about their, if they could recommend one book, what would it be? And they just each had like a page or two describing the book. And only two books were mentioned more than once, the Bible and The Denial of Death.
Wow.
So, the point is, Becker's always had readers.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I've learned. I also thought, well, I'm the only one who cares about this stuff. But you know, the question is why hasn't there been more? You know, why hasn't there been a school of thought, so to speak, in the way? Well, the reason is because he died. He didn't have, you know, he died at 49 years old. He had only just finally gotten a tenure track job. He was kind of a academic gypsy there for a while, going from school to school on short-term contracts. And he finally got a tenure track job position up in Canada at Simon Fraser University. And then he died. I mean, he didn't have a chance to bring graduate students around him, and then they go out and teach and have students, and you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. There was never any institutionalizing of his ideas. Everything that people know about Becker is just from having sat down and read this book or that book. But there's never been like a Becker society in which, for example, Becker would be the main speaker at anything. Mm-hmm. You know, we've had the Ernest Becker Foundation, and they've done, you know, but that didn't start until I think that started in 93 or 94. So Becker was already 20 years dead by that time.
Wow.
And so there just was no institutional backing or support for the emergence of a school of thought. The closest thing to that would be terror management theory and social psychology. And, you know, they've done pretty well. I mean, they now do have the original guys who put this together. And then they have students, and they have students, and their students have students. And so there really is now starting to be a lot of attention to Becker's ideas through terror management theory in social psychology. The thing about that is, though, that you know, they focus in on the effects of death awareness, death anxiety, and so forth. They call it the mortality salience, mm-hmm. on attitudes and behavior and so forth. But you don't really need, you can understand mortality salience just from reading their writings. You don't have to know Becker for that. In other words, it kind of cuts loose from Becker at that point. And even though the people who formulated this and many of their students and so forth, you know, are very versed in Becker and promote Becker's ideas and so forth, when it comes down to it, you can be, you know, a superstar in terror management theory in terms of your work getting published and all that kind of stuff, never having even read a word of Becker. Mm-hmm. It sort of has spun off, you know, the mortality salience idea has spun off as an independent sort of concept in itself. You don't have to read Becker to understand that. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say this, that even though terror management theory does now have quite an institutional backing and so forth, it's a backing for terror management theory, not for Ernest Becker.
Okay. Yeah.
And
understood.
So, yeah.
So do you, in what way then does Becker's understanding of our sort of desire to not want to bring death into consciousness, what way does that differ from contemporary understandings of that idea? Perhaps we should just begin with Becker's understanding of how we, you know, wish to avoid consciousness of death. Well,
Becker was trying to synthesize what he understood to be the essence of philosophy, religious thought, ideas that come from the humanities, and also from social sciences. He was trying to synthesize those things. And what he came to realize is that what all of them are sort of kicking against is the idea of human limitations, accepting human limitations, accepting the fact that we just, that we live within limits. That's the point. And he kind of, he was already starting to recognize that was the common thread running through all this stuff, even before the denial of death. But I think it was with the writing of the denial of death that it kind of crystallized in his mind that what we're talking about here is mortality. The ultimate limitation is the limitation of mortality, the fact that we die. And so once that, in a sense, that once he came to that realization that it's keeping the reality of death, of mortality out of our consciousness, that kind of is the concrete. That's the concrete idea that is then being symbolized in all these different ways in different thinkers. All of a sudden, he saw something. He saw a thread running through Western thought in particular, but not only Western thought, although that's what he was versed in, and everything kind of fell together for him at that point. So the point is that if you're asking about the difference between Becker's ideas of mortality anxiety or death anxiety and mortality salience in terror management theory, the overlap is very strong. But I would say this, that Becker's reading Becker on mortality anxiety or death anxiety is much more a jump into the pool of humanities, religion, philosophy, and so forth. Whereas in terror management theory, you're totally within the realm of empirical social science. Empirical experimental social science. Okay. And you can jump in that pool and then get out and also jump in other pools. But if you stay within that pool, that's what you're getting. So therefore the heart of the meat of what gets discussed is the adequacy of these research methods, and whether, so it's trying to focus in more on it's trying to narrow things more so that we can really say that our findings are significant. Whereas with Becker, it's more you start with that and then move outward. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Instead of starting with that and narrowing so that our research is more becomes more plausible, Becker would have us start at that point and I think move out from there. Or I'm saying Becker, but I don't know. Maybe he would have gone completely in the other direction. But that's my feeling.
Okay. Does Becker ever mention? Obviously, he makes it clear that the majority of people wish to not have, the limitation of mortality in their consciousness as much as they can, and that's why we have these symbols, be it religious, which we'll get to. Does he ever actually mention what happens to men or man if they do actually do that consistently, if they retain consciousness of death as a sort of a path? Or is that
even, in other words,
is that even a possibility for Becker?
Well, Becker understood. Becker thought that mental illness was basically what happens if your strategies for keeping death anxiety at bay fail. Mm-hmm. That's what mental illness is. Mm-hmm. And he thought that all of us kind of skate on the that mental illness. And again, when we think about mental illness, we shouldn't think in terms of there's the healthy and the mentally ill. That's not the way Becker thought of it. He thought of it as a continuum. And you can everyday mental health is kind of being able to hold yourself roughly in the center of these poles but any of us, because of circumstances, can move one way or the other. And so in a way, I guess what I'm saying is Becker he rejected the idea that there's some kind of separation between the healthy and the mentally ill. He thought any of us at any you know, all of us experience the symptoms and so forth that in their extremes we would call mental illness, but they're actually part of our everyday life. Mm-hmm. And you'd have, if you didn't experience that stuff, you'd really be, I don't know about mentally ill, but you'd be a zombie. I mean, if you wouldn't have any, if you didn't experience the ups and downs of life and react to that in different ways and so forth, you wouldn't be a human being. You'd be like a wooden statue or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you mentioned mental health, because this is the bit within Denial of Death where it really clicked for me, is when Becker's writing about schizophrenia, this idea of if a schizophrenic can't adhere to, the state as a meaning, or the family as a meaning, or even consumption as a meaning, which is what the schizophrenic does. They can't really adhere to any identity. Then that actually also moves them away from death, because they can't adhere to anything which has an end. So they're just constantly moving around. And for me, that was sort of a worrying foresight of how it seems we're living at the moment, because we're constantly living in smaller and smaller time frames where we don't have this we don't have a long time preference anymore. Everything is absolutely now. And I don't know if you'd agree with that, but that was where it sort of clicked for me, is in his part about schizophrenia.
Well, I think the best way to understand Becker, Becker was doing all this stuff before there weren't brain scans, and there wasn't all this neuroscience and stuff in his time. He was trying to understand mental illness behaviorally, mm-hmm. from a behavioral standpoint, and trying to describe based on behavior what might be going on in the mind of a person who's experiencing one of the extremes, you might say. And for him, the two extremes were depression on one side and schizophrenia on the other side. Mm-hmm. And you can think of it as mental meanings and body meanings. If either both mental meaning and body meaning, and mental means basically language for him, keep us stabilized. Mm-hmm. But if you move completely in the direction of body meaning, in other words, where you just, you totally have failed, for example, at the symbolic meaning of culture and all that kind of stuff, that's how you end up in depression.
Mm-hmm. Nothing means anything anymore.
Right. Or if you can go the other way, where you're trying to transact life completely on the basis of language only. But that language becomes, for someone suffering from schizophrenia, or let's not even say that, let's say, as Becker understood schizophrenia, those who are on that side of the spectrum have lost the connection between language and body. Mm-hmm. And so they're just out there frantically trying to communicate with people, but they don't have, when we communicate, even over Zoom like this, we depend on facial expressions. We depend on all kinds of cues, body cues, that aren't part of the language itself, mm-hmm. but they're part of the body cues that give us the sense that we're understanding each other. Well, think if those cues were totally gone. You'd just be out there frantically trying to say more, say things, keep talking and so forth, because that's the only way you have to transact reality. But it's cut off from the rootedness that keeps, that holds us together. And so you end up isolated in your own world, and you know what you want to say, or you know what you're feeling, but you can't communicate that with others, nor can you understand what they're saying to you. You can't, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So you can call that schizophrenia, but I hate, like when I'm talking with my students about this, I really, schizophrenia is a brain dysfunction, mm-hmm. probably having to do with when those frontal lobes were in formation during, post-puberty, and where now these frontal lobes are being activated and starting to come online, if you want to use that kind of terminology. And you're starting to experiment with being able to think abstractly, being able to think philosophically, and so forth. And for some people, for reasons we don't even know or understand, for some people that spins out of control. Mm-hmm. And the symbolic functioning becomes separated from the rest of the body, from the rest of the, from the groundedness. And that's a better, I think that's a better way of understanding what's actually going on in schizophrenia. But Becker, of course, was just trying to understand why, for example, why when you're dealing with patients who suffer from schizophrenia, why do you see certain kinds of behaviors like word salad, and that kind of thing. And so he was trying to understand that and describe it as, in the way that he did. But I think we would be, in our time, I think we would do well to just understand that for Becker, depression on one side and schizophrenia on the other side are symbols of the ends of a continuum, and mental health is when we can have a, you might say, walk the middle line. At least, I mean, we vary, we go back and but we don't get too far into the extremes. We somehow can stay within the big middle, so to speak, and therefore we're able to be creative on the one side. I mean, it's not, and we keep from falling into deep moodiness on the other side, and we can communicate with each other, and we can do our daily life and all that kind of stuff. But and so that's what we call mental health. But again, making clear that when we talk about mental health, we're not dividing people into the healthy and the unhealthy. Mm-hmm. That's the problem with the whole language of illness, the medical model and all that kind of stuff. We're not dividing people into the healthy and the ill. We're saying that any of us could be subject to, depending on what's going on in our lives, could be subject to moving to one extreme or the other. And for example, if you're moving this way, then maybe it's your social connections that help bring you back again. Or it might be, some exposure to some new ideas or something that bring you back this way. There's lots of different things that help us, stay in the middle. Just like when you're driving a vehicle. I mean, if you're pulled this way, you have a force that brings you back to the middle. Or if you're pulled this way, you have a force that brings you back to the middle. But depression and schizophrenia, more than being, quote, mental illnesses, are simply the modes of being that any of us could fall into at any time if we veer too far from one side or the other.
Mm-hmm. And for Becker, that was a primary reason for that was because of our relationship with death.
Well, ultimately, as he understood things, in those final books, he was saying that the final, what would you say, the final force that's moving us one way or the other would be how we're dealing with death anxiety at any given moment in time. And in one lifetime, you might deal with it one way at this point in your life and another way at this point in your life. We've all experienced that. Mm-hmm. The maintenance, I mean, when being able to stay in that big middle ground is basically what I think Becker meant by self-esteem. Mm-hmm. What we nowadays would call self-esteem. Being able to feel that your life is meaningful, and that you can take the next step with assurance. Mm-hmm. You can keep forward movement going in your life with some sense of competency and assurance. If you go way out on one side or the other, you lose that sense of competency. You lose that sense of assurance. Time still goes forward, but your life gets bogged down because you don't have that. You don't have the sense of competency and assurance that allows you to move forward with your life. You just get older, but you don't progress.
That sort of balancing act you talk about, I mean, that's throughout history. That's there in certain thinkers. I mean, the earliest I think you could see it is in Galen's work, where he talks about the balancing of the organs. I mean, that's not completely online, but this idea of balancing and keeping in the middle ground is there.
Yeah.
And I mean, it almost seems like Becker's sort of reformulation of the ego and the superego, and keeping within that ego and not going too far in one direction. But the one that really interests me, and I might have got my dates a bit mixed up here, is whether or not there's an overlap between Becker and Foucault at any point, because this was Foucault's big thing on mental health, is that whole idea of not constraining something to the signifier of mental health, because as soon as you do that,
right,
it gets dangerous in terms of how you control people. And there's no,
exactly,
there's no such thing as one therapy for all.
Right. Then the healthy feel that they have a God-given right to control the unhealthy. I mean, for their own good. That's the worst part of it. When I struggled with that as a parent. How much do you impose? Yes, you have more experience. That your child is on a dangerous path, maybe in something, but how much do you impose your will on that child through rules and regulations and threats and et cetera, et cetera? At what point is it better just to hold back and let the child learn by their own experiences? And I struggle with that constantly as a parent, because you want the best for your child, but sometimes the best is to just give the freedom to learn the consequences. You don't, and I think that's so. Becker and Foucault. I don't think Becker ever read Foucault, and I don't think, as far as I know, I don't think Foucault ever read Becker. But both of them are drawing from this long tradition of Western thought, where you have this, the pendulum swings and the that kind of thing. They're all, so both of them, that model. And that's the thing, that Becker didn't create that model for the denial of death. That's something that was in his writings from the very earliest point on. It's just that he started to understand what the stakes were, you might say. As he progressed intellectually, he started to understand what the stakes were in this pendulum swing. But his book where he was laying out what he called transactional model of mental health, which was opposed to the medical model of mental health. That book was, I think, 1964, long before the denial of death. I mean, he only had 12 years of writing books. His first one was 1960, and his denial of death was 1972 or 3, and then Escape from Evil was actually published posthumously. So he really only had about a 12-year period there where he was doing this writing and thinking. I mean, when you think of that, it's pretty, it's like with the Beatles. Sometimes I listen to like early Beatles and later Beatles, and I think, my gosh, and to think that happened all in this very short period of time, Well, that's how I sometimes when I sit back and I look at Becker's work and I think, wow. But there are certain themes that run all the way through his writings, and that idea that life is in the middle, a balance of forces, that's something that runs through all of it.
There was another idea that you sent me in the email, because I mentioned heroism, and Becker sort of mentions the way that our society is structured around it. But in an email to me, you mentioned that there's actually another idea which is alongside heroism, which actually runs concurrently throughout his work.
Well, I would say even more than heroism, but that's my interpretation. There's, different people read Becker in different ways. When I started running into all this stuff in the denial of death on heroism, my feeling was, and I may be wrong about this, but my feeling was that it wasn't that Becker was so much trying to outline heroism, because what he really talks about is the heroism of everyday life. The heroism of just getting up in the morning and going to work, raising your children and mowing your yard. I mean, that's, in a way, just to be able to live, that's the real heroism. And setting up these super people as our models is actually sometimes counterproductive. But my feeling was that he was struggling. He was trying to have a conversation what else was going on in the, in society at that time. I mean, the intellectual discussion, and the big thing going on at that time was Joseph Campbell and the whole, the myth of the hero, and there were some other books that came out with hero in the title and all that kind of stuff. And I thought, my feeling was it wasn't that he was really because all of a sudden this idea of the hero just pops up, and it's like my interpretation of Becker is much less that the hero thing is so important to his thought, and my feeling is that it's there more because he was struggling to find some connection with what other people were interested in, and but I may be wrong about that. I mean, I know there are people that have really pursued the theme of heroism in Becker, and they've come up with some really good stuff that I totally overlooked. I mean, I've read Becker's whole works from start to finish a number of times. One of my books is the Becker Reader with the excerpts and all that kind of stuff. So I would say that I probably know Becker's work as well as anybody, and yet here's this whole theme that I just sort of, I don't know if I'd say I blew it off, but I didn't see it as central. I saw it as a side issue, but I may be wrong about that. There are other very valid ways of reading Becker. The theme that I see the important theme that I see running through all of his writings is this idea of expanded transference. This idea that we have to draw on forces outside of ourselves in order to have the energy, the confidence, whatever, to continue forward movement in life. Mm-hmm. And that this goes back clear to, when you think about it, the earliest experience of every human being that ever lived was total dependency on a higher power, i.e. their caregivers, for their very existence. Mm-hmm. And so we are marinated for years and years in this concept that we ourselves are inadequate, but we need to depend on, those people that are adequate for our, to call, for our very existence. And Becker took that idea and said that not only is something that happens with children, it's not only something that happens with, in the therapy world, between the patient and therapist, or the client and therapist, which we all know about. I mean, any of us who've been in therapy or have pursued therapy know that dynamic, that transference dynamic, where you just think you go through periods of time where you think your analyst or your therapist is just superhuman. If you could only be like them, that kind of thing. Well, Becker sees that going on all over. Becker's idea was that happens all over in society. We project images we feel ourselves, mostly unconsciously, but not always unconsciously, feel ourselves to be, quote, imperfect. And unworthy. And so we project perfection and worthiness, strength, all those kind of things, onto external objects, which can be people, can be, look at what's a muscle car, but a transference object, right? Mm-hmm. So we project those onto people, onto places, onto things, onto ideologies, and then we gain our sense of worthiness and so forth by vicariously identifying with that, with whatever our projections are. And my projections may look ridiculous to someone else, just as their projections look ridiculous to me. But I hang on to my projections for dear life because it really is dear life. Without my projections, without my projected transference objects, I wouldn't be able to move forward. My sense of self-esteem would start to fall apart. And this is a theme that runs from the earliest book through to the end. The big shift that happened with Denial of Death was not that he changed from the expanded transference to something else. but that he started to realize, that's the thing that before he's just talking about unworthiness, inadequacy, and so forth, feelings of those feelings. But now he understands that those are all just ways of talking about our reaction to mortality. Mm-hmm. We feel ourselves weak, inadequate, unworthy, mortal. Mm-hmm. And so we project images of worthiness, strength, immortality.
So does this expanded transference then, do you believe that, or does Becker see that as what is constructed and what develops into sort of a coherent religious framework?
Well, yeah, I mean, in a way, different religions form in different ways, but the religions that are focused on one human being, like Christianity, like Buddhism, and so forth. I mean, there's no question that I'm sure that in the life of the Buddha, or in the life of Jesus, or in the life of Muhammad, they were very wonderful people, and they had a certain sense of charisma and so forth. But as that develops into a religion, then they become even more magnified, and all of the needs that we have, which no human being could possibly satisfy the needs of every human need, so to speak. But the more the religion develops, the actual humanity of that person, originally, the one who was originally a charismatic leader and drew people around them, the actual humanity of that person starts to disappear, and what emerges then is that person as a symbol for all these things that we then pile on, to the point where we get really upset if someone suggests that any of that's an adherent of a religion will get really upset if the suggestion is made that maybe the leader wasn't all that we've cracked them up to be. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because that undermines the plausibility, the legitimacy of the transference that is giving my life meaning, and it allows me to feel worthy, and allows me to feel, because of vicarious identification, feel my forward movement of life.
So that's why people have sort of such a panicked, sort of existential, emotional response to a leader not getting back elected, or because basically their almost transcendental paternal figure has just crumbled. So all legitimacy of this anchor has just gone.
Right, and it in a lot of ways, a dead leader is much more. I mean, I don't mean dead but I mean a leader that's no longer living is a much easier transference object than a leader that you can actually see in front of you, because if the leader's there visibly in front of you, all of their narcissism and all their humanness is there visible to see. But once they're dead and gone and have become something more like a legend, then you can just pile all kinds of perfection onto them that they wouldn't have been able to shoulder while they were actually alive.
Well, this seems sort of key in the terms that Becker sort of states that every society is religious in some way, and yet he in what sense does he deal with the death of God? Because what happens after that? Does he sort of abide by that idea that what is dead can be reborn? So we then actually project, shall we say, a stronger version of Christianity or whatever religion it is, or does he understand after the death of God we are going to build these sort of almost nihilistic structures?
Well, it's interesting in terms of the development of the history of theology. You have this faith in the living God, the ontological God, and then at some point you experience the death of God. Nietzsche was the big town crier, so to speak, of the death of God, and then that permeates out into the culture and so forth. With Becker, but in Becker's own life, it went more the other way. He was your standard academic oriented atheist type, and then little by little his studies brought him around to an awakening of, if not God as an ontological being, certainly the concept of God as productive and even necessary, and maybe even the best thing that can happen for human beings. Because see, the problem with these transference objects, we project power and perfection and so forth onto these transference objects, and then vicariously, by vicarious identification with those transference objects, we then pull from them the power to keep living ourselves. But the problem is that all of our, by definition, all of those transference objects are mortal themselves, and so they're always subject to deflation. Mm-hmm. And the way that we protect ourselves against that is to fight. Anyone who starts to cast aspersions on our transference object, by God, we're ready to fight, you see? Mm-hmm. And in other words, for our transference objects to be plausible over a long period of time, we have to be willing to resort even to violence mm-hmm. in their defense. And Becker's idea was in terms of religion, and it's not like you can point to any one passage where he says this, but you can put this together. And I do believe that if he had lived, he would have come out with a book that would have been really focused on what he meant by God and so forth. But of course, all of us think that if Becker, that if Becker had only lived, he would agree with me. You know what I'm saying? Becker's become a transference object for many of us. There's no question about that. But what Becker was saying is that the evils of human history basically come because we have this clash of transference objects, mm-hmm. this clash of, worldviews would be another way to talk about it. And therefore we have to fight with each other for which one's right. And Becker's suggesting, I think, that the very fact that you have to resort to violence in defense of the transference, to protect the transference, that should already be a signal to you that your transference is false. Okay. You see, mm-hmm, because mm-hmm. the very fact that you think that you, as this puny little human being, can enhance the power and glory of that transference object by your violence or by your just arguments or whatever, that already says that that should already be a signal to you that what we're talking about here is a projection, not something of an ontological reality. And most of our understandings of God are that. But Becker had this idea of that there would be a construction of God, a human construction, a way of thinking about a transference object that not only doesn't need our fighting to enhance its plausibility, but in fact is even recognized as that we would recognize right away that's a detraction from its plausibility, not an enhancement mm-hmm. of its plausibility. And that's where he started to think, well, what kind of a transference object would that be? And he came back around to this idea of the wholly other transcendent God. But the fly in the ointment there, of course, is that part of constructing, part of being able to describe this wholly other transcendent God is to recognize that it's a human construct. Mm-hmm. And so is it possible? This is what he was, I think, in the end of his life, he was kind of struggling with. You can have these religious and philosophical geniuses who are able to live with the contradiction between having a wholly transcendent transference object and recognizing that it's human construct at the same time. But can that really be transferred to the masses? Can masses of people over a long period of time still cast their needs onto a transference object that they recognize as of their own construction. And that was the paradox that Becker was, that when it comes to religion, that was the paradox that Becker was kind of stuck with. He wasn't sure where to go with that, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, that was going to be my big question: is where do you go once the sort of the inherent value of whatever anything is has already been deconstructed? As you said, it's an artificial creation. So there's sort of a, I mean, I guess Becker never answered it. So I mean, I guess there's sort of the pessimistic outlook of sort of saying, we need the herd, we need the they, we need that unconscious thing, because otherwise everyone's just gonna, it's gonna end in some sort of nihilism where people are saying, well, none of this means anything, so why are we abiding by it? I mean, what's your personal take? Where do we go from that?
Well, the place where Becker went with it, and again, he never wrote about this, but you pick it up in letters and other kinds of things. He never published about this, but you pick it up he started daily devotions, reading a psalm every day, and just meditating on a psalm, quieting himself down, and I think that's, I think that can be very instructive for us. Not everyone is kind of meditative in their in their personality type, but one thing that people do, and I certainly see this in the Rouhaniot order of Sufis that I hang out with a lot, meditation. It's like we don't know exactly what it is, what the object of our meditation is, other than what we have in our head, and we can recognize that it's our construct. And yet, when we do this, we find ourselves becoming less frantic. We find ourselves becoming more open to other people and their ideas. We find ourselves becoming more appreciative of other people and their ideas. We find that we are more able to embrace people like ourselves, but also people very different from ourselves. And so in a sense, the place you move, once you realize that the transference object is itself a human construction, you move back into the human community, where we're looking to each other for our strength and our sense of self-esteem and our sense of worth. This is a little bit off the topic, but Andy Warhol talked about everyone gets to be famous for 15 minutes. You know what I'm saying? Well, in a way, fame as a permanent object isn't possible. You couldn't live with that. But in a group of people, we can take turns being the object of each other's love and concern. You see what I'm saying? And so what we can't, so we can do this for each other. That's the point. We don't have to, we can do it in the name of this transcendent God that we've recognized. When it comes down to it, it's a language construction, and language is human, and so therefore it's a human construction. But the everyday experience of it is back into the body, back into the communion of people, and that when you feel the urge to conquer another person in whatever way, that's your signal that, hey, you're out of touch with the, you know what I'm saying? It's the very thing, the very act of quote, defending your transference object by creating disunity among people is a contradiction in terms. The only place that we know that transcendent other is in our relationships with people. And so any relationship that we have with that transcendent other is only experienced and expressed through the building of community among our fellow human beings. And the more and once you start building community, you can't set boundaries. That, that's part of the problem with religions, that religions can become, or not just religions, but any kind of human organization can become very, it's like they want to patrol the borders, so to speak, who's in and who's out, because then they're getting their sense of worth from not being like those people over there, kind of thing. We are different, we are above, and so forth. Well, that's already destructive to human community. someone who's really in communion, touch, whatever you'd say, with this transcendent holy other, only knows that because they experience their desire to have community. The circles of community keep growing and growing, not patrol the borders. Does that make sense? I don't.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you mentioned sort of, devout religion near the end there. It reminds me of this anecdote I was told that I loved. I mean, someone told it to me in relation to like spirit and phenomena and the difference between them. But it's this story of this devout Christian general during the Crusades, marching through these beautiful fields, going through these beautiful villages and all these communities. But to stop him from sort of halting the imminent slaughter, he literally wore a veil. So his sight was just going forward, and it was darkened. So none of this beauty and none of these communities could even enter. So he's completely blocked off, and he's just, as you would say, he's in that one mode of transference. And I can't, if he takes off the veil, then potentially this community could come in. So he remains, sort of locked in until the moment, of sort of reckoning, I guess.
Right, and we're inheritors of a long tradition of seeing someone like that, of admiring someone like that for their single-mindedness and their devotion and blah blah blah. But as a matter of fact, that's become very that way of living has become very dysfunctional. And I think for the human future, and I think we have to move towards a different understanding of role models. It's a heroism, if you want to say it that way. A different understanding of heroism is not the one who's so solidly focused that they block out much of reality just to keep their, so that nothing causes them to raise questions about what they're doing. Rather, it's the one who's the most open and the most, who questions every step of the way and is open to criticism and self-criticism even about what you're doing and open to the wideness of the world, of existence in the world, the wideness of relationship with new ideas, with new people, with new, community, that kind of thing. That's a whole different kind of hero. That's a whole different kind of role model.
Is there anything unique to Becker's work that you would like to add in that you feel we've sort of missed? I mean, I know there's obviously going to be a lot that we've missed, but for a newcomer maybe.
Well, I don't know about that, but I can give you some ideas of mine that I've been just kind of working on over the years and been trying to sharpen up. One thing that I noticed long ago in Becker's writings is that he tends to deal with pretty much the same subjects, but he then each new book he was bringing those ideas into dialogue with whoever he'd been reading lately. So you see there's certain themes that run through, but I've likened his thought to like a conch, where each time he comes around to these ideas, it's with new sources, interacting with new, but there's recognizable continuity as well. And I think that Becker, Becker, with the denial of death, he says he's finally come to his comeuppance or something like that with Freud. He's finally digested Freud and put Freud behind him. Mm-hmm. by this completely, by this total what would you say, existential reinterpretation mm-hmm. of Freud. I think that was, that's a step along the way, but I think that ultimately that's also the source of what is so frustrating about Becker, because it really intellectualizes life. It's something that it's in your head, so to speak. You think about it, and it's very pessimistic. It's like, he ends that book with questioning whether there's even a future for the human species, Maybe we're going to be one more of these species that just, we come and we flourish for a while and then we die out. And so I think that Becker would have ultimately been unhappy with that. I think that's the place where he would have been thinking more. He wouldn't have been satisfied to drop something that pessimistic on human beings and then just, exit the scene. And my thinking, I've really done a lot of meditation on this over the years. My thinking is that the problem Becker had with Freud was this, that Freud had a very, if you think of Freud's basic ideas, that we're born this little id, and then through the socialization process, there's another voice that is externally imposed on us. The voice, Freud called it the voice of civilization, or we could call it the conscience. It's inculcated in us from the outside. And then we spend the rest of our lives, in this dialogue between what the id wants, the id wants what it wants when it wants it now, and this voice of consciousness. Wait a minute, take your turn, think of other people, et cetera, et cetera. And for Freud, the drama of human life, I guess you would say, or the drama, of human development, let's say that, is how do you start with this little bundle of id, and then in a very short period of time, relatively speaking, you end up with this person who's able to live in society and get along with others. Okay, that's good. But always remember that this was a voice inculcated from the outside. It's not the authentic voice of the person. They take it on as authentic, but in Freud's understanding, the real authentic you is that id that wants what it wants when it wants it. It's antisocial. And so Freud's understanding of the human psyche is inherently politically very conservative. I mean, if the voice of civilization, the voice of conscience, is just this thin ice over which we skate, holding down this bundle of selfish idness, vicious behavior, then the last thing you want to do is give people is enhance human freedom. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because especially when we think in terms of the state, the legal function, the police function, the court function, the last thing you want to do is take the shackles off, because all you're doing is making the ice ever thinner, and this bundle of viciousness, this muck that's right under the surface comes bubbling up. And of course, you can understand why Freud would have seen things that way. Think of what it was like to be a Jew in Vienna at the turn of the century. Karl Lagerplatz is still named for this mayor of Vienna whose whole politics were based on anti-Semitism. Freud experienced the discrimination against Jews that in the university system. He watched the rise of World War I, with there's supposed to be the war to end all wars, all that kind of stuff. He saw the rise of World War I and all the terrible stuff that happened there. Then no sooner is that over with, but that now you start to have the rise of the Nazis and World War II. And, in a way, thank God he died a natural death. Death of cancer, but, he died a death before he knew about the Holocaust and all that kind of stuff. But you can just imagine Freud being told about this, and he's just saying, yeah, well, what do you expect? We're talking about a pretty trashy, this whole veneer of goodness, human goodness is just that. It's a really small little veneer. Well, Becker understood the power of that kind of interpretation of human beings, but Becker saw himself as an enlightenment person, a person who wants to enhance human freedom and enhance human. And so he was constantly vexed by this idea that you can show people this whole transference thing and all that kind of stuff, and they'll understand it, and yet they'll turn around and do the, every experiment we've had to try to live beyond that has just turns to shit. And you can imagine, the wryly smiling Freud in Becker's imagination saying, well, what do you expect? Becker watched the hippie movement and the new left and all this kind of stuff just degenerate into Charles Manson and drug addiction and, the materialism and all this kind of stuff. And you can imagine that, in Becker's head, here's Freud just saying, well, what did you expect? Yeah, Gestalt, that's going to do it. Yeah, that kind of thing. And so the thing that really excited Becker when he came to formulate this death anxiety thesis is that he started to understand why simple insight is not enough. It's not going to work because he started to see what was really at stake here was something that we can never have, and that's the conquering of death. What we're really wanting to conquer is not this, that, or the other on the daily basis or even on a political basis. What we really want to conquer is death, and we keep trying to conquer death, projecting it onto our enemies, and therefore we want to. And so this cycle just continues. And so I think that at one point, I think that if Becker had lived longer, one of the things that he would have come around to is recognition that, yes, Freud was right. Freud hung on to this idea. There's no scientific psychology if we can't admit that human beings are animals. Freud was thinking, think in terms of Darwinism was a relatively new idea in Freud's time. And, Freud understood that if we were going to have a scientific psychology, it had to be compatible with Darwin's ideas. And Darwin says, well, if you take evolution by natural selection, what does it say is the root? What's at the root of natural selection? Well, procreation. And for species like ourselves, the willingness to defend our young until they're able to defend for themselves. So Freud takes that and says, therefore, the thing that's at our very root is the sexual urge and fierceness, the willingness to fight. Well, that's right. But the willingness to fight, the willingness to defend even the compulsion to defend our offspring, to defend our young, can be understood not as necessarily inevitably fierceness, but rather connection. What the attachment theorists call the attachment bond. Well, that's a pro-social idea. That's something that's not antisocial, sex and fierceness, but that's a pro-social thing. And I think that ultimately, and Becker, I've only found one place where Becker cites something of Bowlby, but it was long before Bowlby had really developed anything like attachment theory. Actually, attachment theory was being developed at the same time Becker was doing his work, and they were often reading a lot the same sources. So you can see connections that were places where Becker's ideas and attachment theory would connect, but they never actually were connected yet because they didn't seem to be aware of each other. They were doing their work on different continents and sort of in a way in different fields, and so they weren't cross-fertilizing. But if Becker had lived longer, and I think he would have come to the realization that his highly intellectualized existential disposal of Freud is not adequate. Ultimately, we need to come back to, yes, the death denial idea. That's right there in the middle of it's right there in the middle of the human psychological emotional construct, but also sexuality and bonding with each other, the human bonds. And I think he ultimately would have come around to recognize that the problem with Freud was not that Freud like the way you deal with Freud's ideas is not to say, no, we're not animals. We are animals, but we're mammals. We're not reptiles. You see what I'm saying? We're not these individual loners. We're not the little turtles that hatch and run to the sea and never interact with each other again, except, to crawl up on the sand and lay eggs and fertilize the eggs. We are mammals. We're born into families. We're born into herds. We're born into, prides. We crave the attention of each other. We crave the company of others, of our species. We are at our deepest root pro-social, not antisocial. We're not, and so I think that Becker is very original in emphasizing, although not unique, but very original. Something he got from Otto Rank, but he really developed it much more than Rank. This idea of the mortality, resistance to mortality is right there in the adult psyche, but also the sexual urges, the sexual and human bonding, and that those three kind of create a sort of a triune psychology, if you want to say it that way. And they tend to pull on each other for how they symbolize, when you're trying to understand, when you're thinking from the perspective of bonding, it's very natural to pull on sexuality and so forth for your symbolization of that. Or when you're thinking in terms of bonding, it's very easy to pull on the symbols of life and death as ways to symbolize. In other words, there's this kind of triune thing there in the psyche that that interpret each other, so to speak. It's kind of, I think of it as like, when I lived in Europe, especially if you travel to Switzerland or Luxembourg or places like that, you find people that grew up speaking 4 or 5 languages at once,
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that with them, because I was studying philosophy there, so some of them, those people I would interact with a lot. And I noticed with them that a lot of times when you start asking them to explain what they're thinking about, and, let's dig a little deeper, what they do is they just start translating back and forth between one language and the other. You see what I'm saying? It's like you talk about this concept and we're going to go, but what do you really mean by that? And that what they do is they just switch to another language and talk the same thing, say that. And I think that's kind of how it is with that little trio of, and it may be more than 3, but 3 that I can see. And, when it comes to symbolization, each one just kind of draws on the other, and you have this kind of, what would you say, ongoing process of human thought where you don't get any deeper than those 3.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about Becker that leaves us so cold is that by this stark existential reinterpretation of Freud, he in a sense pushes the other 2 out as legitimate. He says they're just, the sexual urge and the urge for bonding, or he didn't call it that, the fierceness, or those are just death anxiety as translated through Victorian lenses, the lenses of Victorian society. And there, I think he was wrong, and I think he would have come around to see that he was wrong. I think ultimately we get too far out on the end of a diving board with nowhere to go but down if we try to exclude those other deep elements of our psyche. But if we can, so I think of it as a return to Freud. That's the way. I think that Becker ultimately would have come back to Freud through attachment theory.
Okay.
And that would have been, if the pendulum were going to keep swinging, that's where he kind of, he went up way on one end, and then before the pendulum had time to swing back again, he died.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, my feeling is, and there are people who know Becker as well as I do and would say, no, you're wrong. And that's fine. But my sense is, or at least where I end up when I've spent a lot of time up in my thinking up at that high swing of the pendulum too. And the place where it's had to start swinging back for me was in this recognition that ultimately we need to come back to the body.
Mm-hmm.
So I relate that to, remember when we were talking about the transcendent God, we need to come back to community, to each other. That's kind of a return to the body. And the way I've been thinking about that is a return to Freud via attachment theory.
Okay.
I don't know. Again, thank you for hearing me out on that. I haven't written anything about this. I haven't. This is just kind of where my own thinking is.
Are you planning to write on that?
Yeah, maybe something. But I'll tell you this. I'm 67 years old now. I mean, I'm really at the end of my career and all that kind of stuff. And there's a couple things going on with me when it comes to writing. One of them is that I recognize that I'm a person born and raised in a literate world, a world of word literacy.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not where the world is anymore. I see this in my students. I see this, I'm kind of I kind of liken myself to the tribal leader back at, in that switch from oral culture to written culture to writing. That oral, that leader whose whole life is being able to remember the tribal stories that go on for a week, and that kind of thing. And then watching these young people go off to the missionary school or whatever, and they come back and they don't see the value of that anymore. They're into, you don't need, if you write them down, you don't have to memorize them, that kind of thing. And he's all puzzled by that. Oh, things are falling apart. How, but we can see in retrospect that somehow we got through. Everything was fine. Well, I often feel like I'm kind of that last generation of people that thinks that intelligence is written intelligence, is writing. The habits of thought of being able to write a 3-point essay with a conclusion at the end, and this kind of linear sort of way of. But my students aren't doing that. For them, it's high-speed images. Mm-hmm. For them, it's much more valuable to be able to surf across all kinds of information and just pick out here and there and put it together. And I look at that and I say, it seems so scattered. It seems so, it doesn't seem like you've ever really sat down and thought about it. Just like the tribal leader back in, who in the transition to oral culture is just convinced that things are falling apart. Look at these kids. They don't want to learn the tribal stories anymore. Well, I feel that way, with these students, they just don't see. But I recognize that that's probably because I'm that fading generation. So I already am of the experience that, I can write another book, but nobody's going to read it, when it comes down to it. I mean, I've published 8 or 9 books, and, well, there's one that's sold, but that was just a translation of sources. That was a source translation. That's the reason that's sold pretty well. But I've written books, number of books that are on university presses that have sold over the years, 200 copies, maybe 300.
But did you write them for, did you write them for that reason? Did you write them because you wanted to write them?
Well, I wrote them because I felt really strongly about the topic and wanted to get that out there and so forth. So I recognize that, and I've had I suppose it's narcissism, but anytime I go to a university, that's not my own, I just check to see if my books are, first of all, in their library. And if so, have they been checked out? And so then you find out nobody's checked out that book for 7 years or something like that. And so in a way, the motivation for writing is already weakened simply because there's this recognition that writing is what's passing away. Communication may happen much more over internet and over, these high-speed images and, which I don't understand that world. I don't live in that world, To me, the internet is just another way of, another form of writing, if you want to say it that way. But for the people that are brought up on it, that's not what it is at all. So I recognize that that's, and then the second thing is, if you really take Becker's work seriously, it does also work against your sense that I've got to create this other object here. I've got to, you know what I'm saying? You start to see your books as not as these great creations that you put so much time into, but you get to be my age and you look at that book and you say, even if someone's praising you for it, boy, I'll get these emails. I ran across this book and I just had the time. And I'm thinking, man, that's the book that I wrote rather than spending time with my child back in 2012. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And from Becker's point of view, just to drop another object into the world, is not what's lasting. What's lasting is the experience of being with other people and the relationships and so forth. And so, yeah, I mean, I've got a book in the works right now. Book, I'm editing it actually. I've only one of the chapters is mine, but I've got one of the, I've got a book in the, and I may do maybe a journal article talking about the ideas of, the re-embrace of Freud or something like that. But I just have to say that I would much rather go and play music, play guitar, with friends and stuff like that than just dig into yet another book that's going to sell 200 copies, which mainly means that libraries have bought it. And then, if you ever get a chance to look, you can see, well, no one's checked it out for 8 years or something like that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I do know what you're saying, but I think you're taking a pessimistic view on that because, with the introduction to the internet, many people would have probably looked at your books online, and things along those lines.
Oh,
so I think it's rare that people would use a university library to actually check things out now as well. So, it's so much quicker.
Well, that's part of the difference between the world it is and the world that I live in. My mental world is still university libraries.
But I think that attitude is actually, I know, the language of healthy and unhealthy is not helpful, but I think that attitude towards looking at the things you're creating and sort of expanding them out on a time frame far longer than your own life, that I think that's a way towards genuine sort of authenticity, and it's a way to realize whether or not if the thing you're doing is actually what you want to be doing,
right?
Because if you start thinking about a book you're writing and thinking about it sort of eroding in some landfill somewhere, but if you think about that and you don't care because that's genuinely almost like unconsciously what you want to do, then why does it matter? But if you start thinking, it's just going to rot or something like that, then it's probably not what you want to be doing in the first place.
Yeah. Well, I'm not saying I don't want to do work. I'm just saying that I don't know that books should be the end result of that work. Maybe teaming up with some young people and putting some of these ideas into stuff that goes out on the internet, in forms other than books might be a more proper end result of the work than to just write another book and Becker likened books to shit at one point, that books are your excrement. They're your external excrement that you digest all this stuff and then you excrete it in a book and put it out there. He was being tongue in cheek, I'm pretty sure, but because he certainly wrote more books after that. But
I think it was Foster Wallace as well said your first book is your big shit. It's like everything, and then after that you start to go, I didn't need to do all that.
Actually, if I looked it up, it's very possible that he was riffing on Wallace when he said that. Yeah, it's because I know that he did. Oh, wait a minute! You're talking about David Foster.
Yeah,
Wallace.
sorry,
I'm talking about another. I'm talking about another guy that he. I do remember there was this writer named Wallace that was in his bibliographies and stuff. But that would have been a different one, of course. Mm-hmm. By the way, do you know that David Foster? I'm at his university here.
Oh wow!
Yeah, oh, wow. Not his final one, but he taught here for years. He only his time and my time only overlapped by about 2 or 3 years.
Did you ever get to meet him?
I saw him around. Yeah.
Oh wow! Are you a fan?
I like the shorter writings. The really long stuff. I don't know. I'm not saying I don't like his work and that I don't recognize the power of it and all that kind of stuff. But man, I don't know. If I'm gonna sit down with an 800-page tome, there's other things I'd probably do first. But the other books that have been on my reading list for years and years that I didn't, but I have read a lot of his collected essay kind of stuff, and those I like really well. I think he's very clever, and I think I would have liked to have had a chance to sit down and talk with him about Becker, because I think that he would have, if not Becker himself, at least the concept of mortality anxiety. I think he would have felt a lot of connection to that idea.
Yeah, definitely, because I think his philosophy thesis was on fatalism, I believe. So I'm sure he would have, enjoyed that. But speaking of reading, where would you advise listeners to begin with Becker?
The Birth and Death of Meaning, 2nd edition.
Okay,
that's the one.
That seems a very definite answer. How come not? How come not the Denial of Death?
Well, because if you read The Birth and Death of Meaning, you're going to go on to the Denial of Death anyway. But The Birth and Death of Meaning is much shorter, and it's much more, it's much more accessible. The language and you can if you don't have some pretty solid acquaintance with psychoanalysis, the Denial of Death can be a little, you can get lost in it really easily. But Birth and Death of Meaning, the 2nd edition, not the 1st edition, that was also good, but that was a different book. I don't even know why they did this. It should have been a whole nother book, but I guess but the Birth and Death of Meaning, 2nd edition, which was the book that he put out just before Denial of Death, you have already the death anxiety idea formulated there in a kernel form, in a seed form. But it's much more. It's written much more in a style of I don't want to say chattiness, but and journalistic is not the right word either. But much more like you're just sitting down and having a talk with each other, rather than this really heavy kind of writings. Although I love his writing, I mean, I was never bored. I've never been bored reading Becker on anything. His writing it really grabs you. But The Birth and Death of Meaning, that's the 2nd edition, which came out, I think, in 1971. That's the best. That, to my way of thinking, that's the best way into Becker. And I don't think I've ever met anyone who read that book that didn't then also want to read The Denial of Death, subsequent to it.
Okay. Okay, that's great. I think that's a good place to finish up. Thank you very much.
All right. I hope this works out. I hope you got what you want from me.